Gotta be quiet.
All right. So welcome to Monday, October 2nd, Solid Ground live stream. This is our 39th, if I'm counting correctly, live stream. And today we have special guests with us from Canada to talk about what's going on up in Canada, because there's a lot of really good movement there regarding, the cultural revolution that we're experiencing and people pushing back against that. And so we have Catherine Kronas, Julia Malott, and Pfahl with us. Thank you so much for joining us. I've had conversations with each of you individually on this channel. So if people are interested in going back and hearing a little bit more of what you have to say, they can search you. And I'm sure you'll give hopefully your contact info that you want to put out, Twitter or your socials, but also you can look at this channel and have a little bit more in-depth insight. But first, David, do you want to start us off with the Solid Ground blurb?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So I'll just introduce Solid Ground. Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice, CSJ, aka woke, and or COVID mandates in their workplace, university, children's school, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies, and to answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join one of our groups from only $5 per month. To find out how to join our community, please visit solidgroundsupport.com. And please note, Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we do this live stream weekly, Mondays at 10 a.m. Pacific. We are taking next week off. So I know I mentioned that a couple weeks ago, but just a reminder, we won't be here next week. And we usually have Jennifer Friend with us. She's not here today. Jody's here today. Thanks for being here, Jody. And so would Catherine, Julia, and Chanel, would you mind just giving just a quick intro of introduce yourself really quickly for anybody who may not be familiar with you, and then we can jump right in. Catherine, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, my name is Catherine Kronas. I've been organizing parents and educators across Canada for 2.5 years with a network that I founded called Lighthouse Network. That's how I met both Julia and Chanel. I also ran for school board trustee for my Hamilton Wentworth District School Board in Ontario. And I am actually, as we speak, I'm trying to get on the parent council there too at my son's school, and just really, really involved in trying to organize parents and, fighting back on these important issues.
And where can people find your work if they want to follow what you're doing?
Sure. You can find the website lighthouseforum.ca. You can find me on Twitter. It's pretty much the best place at Catherine Kronas.
Excellent. Julia?
Hello, my name is Julia Malott. I am transgender, and I got involved in a lot of these discussions a few years ago, also running for a school board trustee here in Canada. And yeah, over the last few years, I've been really concerned with what I've been seeing in terms of the intersection of critical social justice and transgender matters in particular. And so I do a video blog called A Lot of Thoughts, where I explore many of the kind of tenets of that ideology in a more accessible manner. I don't use the word ideology or any of the stuff in the literature. I try to boil it down to the fundamentals. I also write opinion pieces for the National Post, which is Canada's largest center-right newspaper. I can be found on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube under A Lot of Malott, which is very difficult to spell. But if you search Julia Malott, then you'll find me.
Chanel?
Hi, I'm Chanel Pfahl. I am 30 years old. I taught high school for a couple years, 2017 to 2021. I ended up getting in some trouble because I made a Facebook comment in a in a private Facebook group in January of 2021 or February of 2021. I can't remember. Basically, I opposed critical race theory, and I said that schools should be nonpartisan, not political, and all that stuff. Somebody reported me, and then I got investigated, and then I basically just doubled down. So now what I do is I expose a lot of what's happening in schools. I also ran for trustee last fall with Catherine and also with Julia in different regions. None of us got elected, unfortunately, but we I don't know, maybe next time around. I don't know if you guys are still considering it, but Anyway, yeah, that's me. You can find me on Twitter at Shan El Pfahl, like Julia. It's hard to spell, but I did put it on the screen there, or you could just type my name, Pfahl, Pfahl.
Excellent. And we have a Canadian in the chat so far, at least one. Seawolf says, hello from Vancouver Island. I was at the Megan Murphy event last night. Hello, Seawolf. And I think you guys are on different sides of the continent, but still there's a lot going on in Canada. And the marches that were happening last week, the Millions March for Children, is that the correct name for the marches? I was seeing a lot of these. What was it, Chanel?
1 million March for Children.
1 million March for Children. And I watched, all of you had a lot of coverage of this on your Twitter, and there were just a bunch of, it was really encouraging to see so many people turning out. Does somebody want to kind of set that up and introduce what's going on and what's this movement about?
Go ahead, Julia.
Oh, I've been nominated. Lovely. Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because there's a lot of people involved in, like most grassroots movements. I don't think you get the same answer depending on who you ask. My observation is that there has been a lot of frustration with the school system up in Canada for a number of years in terms of the lack of agency and autonomy that parents are extended when it comes to their children. And that spans in a lot of different directions, but there's been particular focus in the last 8 to 12 months on the gender identity, gender ideology side of that, in terms of what's being taught, in terms of how it's being taught, in terms of what resources are available to students, in terms of how social transitions are brokered at school, whether parents are involved, informed, or have any say in what's happening at all, in terms of medical transition for children, in terms of if that's allowed, and if so, how that's allowed. And this march that took place on September 20th, I would say was the first time we've seen kind of large scale organization. There's been many grassroots organizations that have been speaking about this for a long time, with their own particular purviews, whether that's geographically or from a particular slant or angle. But in this September, we saw a lot of them come together unified. And it was actually organized by several different Muslim leaders with various organizations, which is new, I would say. When I've looked at the last 12 to 15 months, we haven't seen that much involvement from the Muslim community on these matters, but they mobilized and they put this together. And so parents got together, parents and other community members in various cities across Canada. I think there was almost 95 sites in total, if I remember correctly. And how each of those sites played out, of course, depended on the location. Some were very, very large and had many thousands of people. Some were much, much smaller. But usually there was some element of protest and some element of march that took place.
It's really encouraging to see the mobilization up there. But we saw Canada, the trucker convoy, that the trucker protest was massive. And I guess there's this stereotype of Canadians as being really nice. And so is there a reason why is Canada more falling to the ideological capture for any particular reason? And what's the spirit in Canada around this? Because we see both maybe a little bit of an intensity in terms of how much ideological pressure is coming down on Canadians, but then you also see these really beautiful collections of citizens coming together. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Catherine,
That sounds like a Catherine question to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot with that. I think that Canada is obviously very much more ideologically left than the United States. And so that's been like the current for many, many years. So for Canadians to be able to recognize even what's going on as a problem, it's been a little bit of a challenge to, wake up sort of like the moderates to what's happening. I think though that the pandemic was eye-opening for many Canadians, and this is why we had it ended up with the trucker convoy where people were completely fed up with what was happening. And since then, those groups that were fighting sort of around the vaccine and the mask mandate issues have sort of become awakened to what was happening with sort of the gender ideology in schools and the other ideological movements in schools like critical race theory. So I think what happened this past week was quite amazing because it did seem to spring out of almost not out of nowhere, but like a lot of new groups were popping up and sort of jumping on this bandwagon, groups that we had never heard of before, and people participating in the protests who would never be caught protesting in the past. Indeed, myself, I would say that I'm not necessarily a protest person. I attended the convoy, and I was protesting gender ideology at the convoy, where alongside Billboard Chris, if you guys know who Billboard Chris is. And so this week was really quite exciting, but it was also, nobody knew what to expect in terms of how successful it was going to be. I participated in the march in Toronto, and I can tell you it was very ideologically diverse and ethnically diverse. And it was very, very interesting to see that everybody was there for, I mean, I was there for parental rights, and parental rights was supposed to be the crux of the issue and the reason for the march, to make sure that parents are informed of what's happening in their schools, and to make sure that their children are not exposed to gender ideology if they don't want, the parents do not want their children to be indoctrinated with gender ideology in schools. That was the main thrust of the march, but other people and other groups were there for different reasons. Some were there for concerns about materials in schools and library books that are considered quite graphic or offensive. I don't know if Chanel wants to jump in and add more to what I was saying.
Oop, Chanel, you're still muted there.
I knew I was going to do that. I think you covered it quite well, and Julia too, just talking about how we all came together from different spheres and whatnot. And I just feel like, as somebody who's out there with my Twitter DMs open, and I'm pretty bad at getting back to people, but I try my best. But I've just had an influx of people who are like, okay, what can I do? Like, do you know someone in this area? Or like, they are just getting activated, and it's really nice to see. I think there is a lot of education needed, like in terms of just what is happening in schools. Like, some people will say, oh, no, you can just opt out of sex ed, which is true in Ontario, for example. And in BC, I think is the same. You can opt out if you want, but we're talking the actual curriculum, like the phys ed curriculum. But what they have to understand is that woke ideology is just pervasive. It's in every subject from K to 12, and you cannot opt out of that. So I think people need to understand that, because a lot of people are saying, like, for example, I had a message last week from a teacher in New Brunswick saying, oh, it's really good. I think they're gonna put in an opt out of sex ed now. Like, they're working on that apparently. And I'm just like, no, I think that's actually a really bad thing, because it's going to give a lot of people false hope, and they're just going to say, oh, good, like, we don't have to worry about this anymore. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So.
Right, it comes in through all the anti-bullying policies, and every board in Ontario, well, actually in Canada, but we'll just keep the focus on what's happening in Ontario, because that's where we're from, and that's the system that we know the best. We have the Ontario Human Rights Commission. They're saying that all boards must, the Ministry of Education needs to follow what the Ontario Human Rights Commission is saying in Ontario, and the Ministries of Education have basically dictated to each board that they must have human rights and equity policies, and basically these anti-bullying policies in the schools. So this is coming in at every assembly. This is coming in during, like Chanel was saying, at every classroom, certainly on weeks like Trans Awareness Week and Pride Month, and every single Rainbow Day. These sort of the ability to sort of pop in gender ideology into the curriculum or into the classroom is what's happening. And the thing about it is, is that it really depends when you send your child to school. It really depends on what teacher your child has, because if you have an activist teacher who has been basically just fresh out of teachers college, fully indoctrinated into this stuff as well, and particularly the younger teachers, they want to work hard, they want to please, they think they're doing something good, then your child is going to be exposed more so than perhaps a more like classically liberal minded teacher who does not want to actually broach these topics at all in the classroom. So it's really about parents have to getting to know their teacher, who their teacher is, what their sort of how politically fervent they are, and basically follow them on social media and see what they're posting as well, because a lot of the more activist teachers love to brag about what they're teaching in the classroom on social media, as Chanel will know, because that's what she posts about almost exclusively.
Yeah, I've seen some of the content that you've been posting lately, Chanel, and it's just really shocking. These slides.
I don't know how it's not making more of a wave than it is. Like, I get that like people are upset about it. It gets like 1,000 likes, 2,000 likes, and people are like, oh, and then it just stopped. Like, I don't understand how this is allowed. Like, people, okay, these math teachers at the York board, which is, well, anyway, not in Julia's region, not in Catherine's region, but near Toronto, and anyway, each school has a math leader or more than one math leader, and they go to this math network thing like every month or whatever, a couple times throughout the year. So for this, obviously, you can imagine they get taken out of their class. So they need to pay a supply teacher. They need to still pay these teachers. They need to also pay the people training them. And it's supposed to be for learning math, or like focusing on math curriculum changes or new resources or new research and stuff like that. What it actually is, which I was about to post about this morning, and unfortunately I had like an 8-paragraph tweet that I deleted by accident, so I have to restart. But it's going to come out today. But it basically they sit there and they do 90% CRT all year. That's all they do, is they learn about oppression and about how the education is furthering white supremacy. They have to literally sit there and you might have seen it actually. I posted this one picture like a month or two ago. It's a picture that you have to accept that the institution of education is a tool for maintaining and furthering white supremacy. You have to accept that you will sit in discomfort and blah, blah, blah. And like, there's just all of these things that teachers are just supposed to sit through, not say anything. And like, I don't.
These are trainings for the teachers?
These for math teachers. Like,
okay,
of
the
all
teachers they aren't saying anything. It sounds like there's incentives for this, right? Catherine, weren't you just talking about like that there's like money that the schools are getting and like they have to implement all this equity stuff? I mean, that's what's happening here. And a lot of it came through these COVID recovery bills. I forget what it was called, like
HERF, like the Higher Education Relief Fund or something.
Yeah, and also for lower schools, it was like the pandemic relief money. But then if you went in and read it, there's all the stuff about equity and social justice stuff, and like you have to if you accept this money, and it was a lot of money. It was like $10 million. I don't know if it was per school or district or state. I don't know, but it was a lot of money. So if you didn't agree to implement these little things, you weren't going to get any of the money. Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, it sounds like there's incentives for the schools to be doing this, and then they let peer pressure do the rest.
Right. It's also like board staff. And I think what I'm trying to awaken people in my board, like parents in my board, is to understand that the way that the system is structured is like this Million March for Children. It was about parental rights. Like, parents are being excluded from what's happening in the classrooms. These procedures and policies are being developed without our knowledge or consent. And the system is set up to keep that in place. In other words, to keep parents in the dark and to keep us out of the conversation. And yes, Jody, there is a number of organizations in Canada that are benefiting from, for example, particularly the gender ideology, the LGBTQ plus communities. They're receiving millions in federal and provincial funding. So that is a incentive. But also the board staff that are working, they're making upwards 150, 200, and the director of educations are making $300,000. And so they're, what's happening is, okay, so Julia and Chanel and I, we ran for school board trustee last year. Trustees are, we would think, are supposed to represent their constituents. So you vote for your trustee gets the most amount of votes, that trustee is supposed to now represent your voice to the board, right? That's the way you think would work, but that's not the way it's working. What's happening is the trustees are being elected. Most of our boards in Ontario have predominantly activist trustees. So they're going to continue with that activist agenda. And any parent, and they've got voted in on that activist agenda, and I guess they should speak to that activist agenda. But the trustees, like if they were voted in and they don't have an activist agenda, what's happening is those trustees are not speaking up for their constituents. They're actually being, so trustees are supposed to make policy. They're supposed to vet policy. They're supposed to talk to their constituents and then go back to the board table and make the policy. It's supposed to, the board is supposed to represent the community. But what's happening is we've got these unelected board staff, superintendents, director of education, equity advisors that are given the policy that the trustees make, come up with the procedure, are given like carte blanche to do whatever they want, and parents are not consulted. And the trustees are not consulted on these procedures. And it's those procedures, for example, we have a gender identity procedure in my board, Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, that is very explicit about socially transitioning kids without parental consent, allowing boys to self-ID into girl spaces, into girl sports, etc. And parents who are like saying, let's have some discussions about that. We're being completely shut out. The board has even said that they will not discuss it with parents. So you've got the trustees who are supposed to represent the constituents, but what they're really doing is they're representing the board to the constituents.
Well,
So
some
the powers, sorry, go ahead, Chanel.
Some trustees do speak up really quite eloquently, and they know what they're standing up for, right? Like classically liberal values, and they're brave, and they do this, but they just get smashed down right away. Like the code of conducts are just weaponized against them all the time. Like example, Linda Stone, you should look that up if you want, or Mike Ramsey, or there's like a lot of others. But I just want to not forget that there are some trustees who are trying to do good work, and even then they're not able to get anywhere really.
Right.
Is there in Canada, like we see in the US, of people going, fine, I'm going to pull my kids and go to charter school or go to private? Is that, I don't know what the percentage of
schools.
So you could do, yeah, okay, so that's not even an option, right? So I guess they could go to a private school maybe, but I'm imagining there's not much supply of that, right? So people are stuck with the situation. Is that...
Yeah, I mean, even private schools, a lot of them are woke. Like they actually advertise as like being woke. You could just go on their website and they're all about the inequity and stuff like that. There are some that don't push it, but I imagine it's just out of reach, like financially, for a lot of people. So,
Gotcha.
You know, I was just listening to this conversation, and I thank you, Catherine, for naming some of the specific things that are happening, like allowing students to self-ID, so they can, boys to self-ID to get into girl, and then they have full access to girls, carte blanche access to girl spaces. But I was just like imagining somebody watching us right now talking, and who's not really, who might think, oh my God, they're just a bunch of like right-wing people, and they hate gay people, and they hate trans people. So maybe I think, like, I would like to hear, even though I know, and I think a lot of us know, but like, what are some of the actual things that parents, like, a lot of people might hear you say, oh, LGBTQ groups are getting a lot of money and they're getting funding. It's like, people might be like, well, what's wrong with that? You know? So what are the actual things that are happening that parents might have an objection to? Like specifically, what are these anti-bullying policies, and what are some of the things that are happening in schools?
Julia, you want to answer that because you've been a little quiet.
Oh, sure. There's plenty, depending on the parent and depending on the angle. I'd say the loudest one that we're hearing right now is the social transition in schools without parental consent or involvement. So social transition here referring to name and pronoun changes. And pretty much every school board in Ontario has an explicitly written policy, as Catherine described at her board, that says that if a child wants to proceed down that transitionary path and doesn't want their parents to be told for any reason, then the school will take an active role in both facilitating that social transition and in preventing the parents from knowing. And I think that the active role part is really key here, because we're not just saying that if a student does something on the playground and a teacher sees it, whether they're going to take that to the parents or not. We're saying if the student comes forward and says, my name is Jason, but I want to go by Julia and I want to use she, her, then the teacher will implement that. They will do that in their classroom in front of all of the other kids. They will let the other teachers know. But everybody also knows that the parents do not know this. The office staff know, though, that if Jason's parents call, it's Jason, it's not Julia. And parents were not aware of that until pretty recently in Ontario. And understandably, a lot of people are quite upset. I am transgender and I can empathize with what the school is trying to do. I'm also a parent and I would be very upset if that was happening behind my back, because this is not a neutral act, because there can be comorbidities and other mental health factors at play. And it's complex. And while there are certainly lots of opinions on whether children should socially transition at all or not, I personally strongly believe that including the parents in that conversation is important.
Yeah, and I just want to mention too, like that is the default position. Like if a kid comes to a teacher and says, hey, I want to go by this pronoun, the default position for that teacher would be to not tell the parents. Like it's not, the kid doesn't have to say, hey, don't tell my parents. That is the default, unless the kid gives direct, like it's explicit consent to do so.
And it's very much an intervention. I mean, it's a psychosocial intervention that's being performed without the knowledge of the people who know that child best. This reminds me a lot of the mature minor doctrines that have swept through allowing schools to vaccinate children with the children's consent without the parents' knowledge. And I know one's a psychosocial and one's more biomedical, but it's still this, you're removing knowledge of something really important about your child from the people who are going to be the ones who would care most about the unintended downstream consequences of whatever this act is. So if there's in the vaccine case, a kid comes home and has some kind of a reaction, parents don't know that has anything to do with something that's been done to the child. And it just seems like this is a part of a bigger anti-parents' rights movement.
And
Yeah,
the
like
age of consent slide. Oh, sorry.
I was just the child belongs to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but the parents have to pay all the bills and take care of the child and feed the child. But we're gonna control what the child does, and we're not gonna tell you.
Yeah.
And it's also an age of consent slide, right? Because we just have these things that sooner and sooner and sooner children are having, total autonomy over decisions.
And the other thing about it is that this has been going on for, and parents are just finding out, at least in my board, but I would say it's pretty consistent in boards throughout the province, that these sort of policies to not tell parents have been in place for over 10 years. And we are just finding out about it now. We just had seriously a board meeting, or like a meeting with the chair of the board, and she just admitted it just like last month. So they did not have anything to explicitly presented in terms of policy available on websites. They're not telling parents that this is what's going on. So, the fact that we're just getting wind of this now, 10 years in.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, it's all done. It's done intentionally. They don't want it. They've been shooing this stuff in under these human rights and equity sort of concerns. Now in Canada, again, in Ontario, we have the Human Rights Commission. And the boards are saying that these policies, in other words, the policy to socially transition a child without parental consent is in keeping with Human Rights Code. But we're saying, well, that there's nothing to say in the Human Rights Code that is going to basically discriminate against, gender identity or expression if you were to tell parents about what's happening with their children in school. So, I mean, this is what the fight is between on the one side, the activists saying child has rights, child's rights trump parental rights. And on the other side, we're saying, well, no, part of what we need to do to protect children is part of their child rights, is part of having an authority figure take care of them and make sure that they're looked after properly.
I think.
Oh, sorry. I was just
No,
going
go
to ask.
ahead.
I was
We
gonna say,
haven't even heard your voice.
I was just thinking, like, how is this rationalized to these people? I was just trying to put myself in their shoes. Like, obviously, we can understand that ultimately there's a push to get state control over kids and remove parents, and that's a control thing. That how this is rationalized to teachers who do keep parents out. I was just thinking, is it at the point a child maybe makes the discovery, whether they found out from the teacher, whether they've been on TikTok or something like that, and they've brought something to the classroom themselves? Do you think there's a sort of, like, I don't know if it's implicit or explicit kind of judging that perhaps because that child has only just discovered that, and in fact they are a different gender, that's a failure by the parents to have allowed, you know what I mean, to have allowed them an opportunity to be their real gender, that's a failure because they've managed to get to this point without knowing that gender? I'm just trying to understand how they could rationally.
Yeah, what's the
Absolutely.
rationale?
Like, it'll be like, well, if you were doing parenting right, like your child would tell you. So obviously your child has a reason for not telling you and all this stuff. Like and they also weaponize the whole suicide thing, right? Like this is the rationale for not telling parents. It's like, well, the child needs affirmation, and if the parents aren't going to affirm, then the child will be at risk of suicide and all these things.
I think there's implied abuse too, like, and certainly let's acknowledge there is abuse, right? Like I lived through the 90s, right? Like there were a lot of kids being sent to these conversion camps, gay kids, and it was horrible. It's horrible. And people getting kicked out of colleges. Like I know somebody got kicked out of Wellesley because she was found in a room with another girl, and she was removed. The college said, you can't stay here, you're lesbian, forget it. Like it was really bad, and probably is still bad in some cases. So I think that's probably, I'm imagining they're using that as justification, that in order to prevent any possibility of any abuse by the parents, we're gonna completely remove any knowledge. And it's tough, like Julia said. I can see it's a complex situation, but it is a major thing, and the child will turn 18 at some point, right? So I can see what you're saying about the suicide, like that they're going to cause suicide, and I know those statistics are like questionable.
But if you're assuming a social background, like what you're saying, Jody, like that sort of intolerance, sort of anti-LGBT sort of background, imagine a very conservative sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then that makes sense in a different way. But once you've started to introduce all these ways of encouraging kids to explore this stuff, you've changed the whole milieu in which the kids are growing up. So you've changed the incentives, the pressures, and now you're talking about a different, it's a different petri dish that the child is growing up in. And one of the things that keeps coming up is this black and white thinking. Like if you don't support this, then the kids are going to kill themselves. And if you are against this, then you're anti-trans or you're anti-LGBT. And so there's a lack of nuance in the conversation. And I like what you guys were talking about, the diversity of the people coming out, the diversity of ideology or background. And certainly, Julia, you're not standing there as an anti-trans person, and
she still probably gets called anti-trans all the time, right?
Really?
Are you a TERF?
I do get that on Twitter sometimes, but no, I think you touched on the strongest argument, not strongest, but the most frequent argument that comes up, which is the harm that could be caused to children at home if this is a household that is dangerous. And it's a tantalizing argument because it is true. We know those households do exist, and we know that there are lots of cases where that could be a problem. I respond to that in two ways. The first thing that I will express is that that's true in a lot of cases. And we don't hide other things from parents. An example I've put in an article before is marks. You know, how many kids might be at danger of harm if they get a bad report card that comes home? And we are not arguing that we should stop including parents in academic successes out of fear of what might happen in a bad case. And actually, I put that in an article and then I was told that that's incorrect and given some examples where schools have started to do that. So apparently, you know, we're just going to pull parents out entirely. But you know, my argument is we shouldn't do that. And that we have always had mechanisms in place through Children's Aid Services in order to handle those tragic and complex cases. And that comes to the, you know, the other side of this, which is these kids live in this household. And what is the end game plan here? I have been through a social transition and I've been through a surgical and hormonal transition. And if there's anything that makes you more desperate, more excited to continue down the path, it's starting down the path. And so if you start them on a social transition at school and they don't have proper psychological and psychosocial support, they may be excited. They may find this is working and they want to go even further. They're going to have to tell their parents at some point. And now we're not saying, hey, I feel this way, I'm thinking about this, but telling our parents, actually, for 2 years, I've been going by Julia and I've already booked an appointment for hormones. Like, and what happens when your 14-year-old tells you this? So if we're going to have to face the fact that they have parents, that they live in this household. And if there really is a danger that they're going to be physically or emotionally abused, then they live in a physically or emotionally abusive household. That is a danger in a lot of ways, because I have not met a single household that is perfectly safe and happy unless someone becomes trans. If there is risk of physical and emotional abuse, then there's a risk of that abuse in so many different ways.
So
Right,
you
and
would
Idea how this mistrust of parents, I mean, there could be the Marxist angle, but like, it's amazing to me the amount of mistrust of parents that there is going around. And are there other factors other than, you know, you could have the Marxist angle of, you know, having the state sort of take over, but it just blows my mind.
Deborah, there's something else though that in terms of the parental consent, because I'm concerned about parent knowledge for all parents, not just for parents that are like more traditional or conservative or classically liberal minded. I'm concerned about the parental rights of the people that are on the other side of the issue, that are more left leaning. And so when you like in our board, when they say children as young as 4, they could socially transition without parental consent, that child, 4, 5, 6 years old, might have a very supportive parent at home. How would you know unless you actually ask the parent whether or not they're supportive or not? Number one. Number two, doesn't that parent, if that parent wants to have their own parental rights, aren't they deserved to know what's going on with their child? Because maybe they would want to socially transition their child. Maybe they would actually want to gender affirm their child. And by you're taking that away from potentially parents who would be perfectly supportive of that. Now, I disagree with that personally, but if we're going to be talking about parental rights, we need to extend it to those parents as well. So it's not just about my rights as a parent. I want them to be able to have input on what's going on in their schools. And then Julia also alluded to the fact that when you socially transition a child, yeah, great. You're doing it during school hours where they're spending like 6 hours, but then they have all the time after school. They have weekends, they have summer vacations. So what about consistency of care? Doesn't that play into the concern of the child's well-being? So a lot of these questions are things that we're trying to bring to the table, and boards across the province are shutting us down. And they won't even entertain conversations. And those of us who try to bring these issues to the table are being shut out as hateful. And in terms of this Million March for Children that went on this past week, the boards were coming out with letters declaring the protests hateful, and all the parents that were participating
before it even happened.
and then also again they reiterated it, like doubled down after it happened. So all the people that are concerned, all the people that have criticisms of what's going on, we are harming people. We are bad people, essentially.
I just want to acknowledge really quick that Julia told us ahead of time she needed to leave it at the half-hour mark. So, and Jody, you have to leave too? Okay.
I'm sorry. This is
Okay.
great.
Well,
Thanks for having
thanks
me.
for being here, Jody. And we're grateful that Julia was able to join us for the first half hour of this as well.
Bye, Catherine. Bye, Chanel.
Bye,
Bye, Jody.
Jody.
Hi, Jody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the go ahead, Deborah, did you have a
Oh, no,
follow-up?
I was waving.
Oh, okay.
I guess part of this that we should be addressing too is just like we are living, well, I guess you did address it, Leslie. We're living in a completely different petri dish now, right? So the students are not just coming to this conclusion on their own, where there's like 1 in 10,000 who feel that they're born in the wrong body and they're having gender dysphoria that's severe and all this. And then, that would be a completely different conversation. It probably wouldn't require all these policies and this nonsense because it would happen so infrequently that it just wouldn't even be like a thing, right? Because these policies, as Catherine mentioned, were put in like 10 years ago or something like that. Maybe not as extreme as they are now, but back in that time, there was probably like 1 in, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000. Now there was a protest at a school board in my area in Ottawa, the Ottawa Public Board, where the gender consultant for the board was outside. She was protesting, with all her trans activist friends there. And somebody from the anti-woke sides asked the question, how many kids are actually trans? Like in this school board or in Ontario or whatever, how many, like what is the percentage of children that we're talking about? And she stepped forward and she said, there are 13% of kids that identify as gender diverse or trans. So 13%. So that could be like trans, non-binary, like all these things. So we're talking an enormous amount of kids. And this same teacher, because she was a teacher before becoming a gender consultant, had a grade 4 and 5 class where she had 30 kids, and she posted on Twitter that 7 out of her 30 students had come out to her as trans or gender diverse or whatever. And she alluded to that being because of how inclusive she is and that they felt comfortable that they could come to her. So
that's like 20%. That's like 20% of her class almost. And gender consultant, like that the school has a gender, there's so much here.
Probably more than one too. Like there's gender, like people have the title gender this, gender that, all over the province.
Wow. It's a serious intervention for a serious concern. I mean, the idea of gender dysphoria, that the child would experience such an extreme discomfort with the alignment of their physical body to their mental conception of themselves. It's a serious thing that should be, like, I think when Julia's talking about how if you take the kid down this path quite a ways before you introduce the family to this idea, then the family's having a big shock once the child is very far along and entrenched in this concept of themselves. Why wouldn't you, if this was such an enormous decision in this child's life, why wouldn't you, let's just even get on their side and take it seriously, that they really feel concerned about these kids and that they really want to help them to be as successful and happy in their lives. Why wouldn't they have like an intervention where they work with the family to try to create the most smooth process for this person? Even if you're going along with the idea that, yes, we really legitimately have 13% of people who need some kind of transitional intervention, why wouldn't you involve the family to make this the most successful outcome for that person possible? It's just fundamentally incoherent, their whole policy.
Well, and you're also just getting into mental health. And to some extent, if you were to do that and have the school as involved, it's like then the school is way up in someone's mental health in a way that feels way beyond the bounds of what a school should be doing, right? If you did take it that far.
And I think that Julia sort of pointing to this too, like the fact that I think it was Rob Henderson. He did a YouTube video on luxury beliefs, but he calls these as luxury beliefs. And so what's happening here is these teachers, and by the way, I've been talking to a number of teachers across the province, across the country, who have had to do this, have felt that they have been forced to socially transition, like call a child by their different pronouns, by a different name, and the parents are not have no knowledge or consent of this, and the teachers feel that if they were to speak up on this issue, and they're probably right, they will probably get fired or disciplined. So they go along with it, unfortunately, because that is the written policy and they are required to do that. But just getting back, so the teachers, particularly the activist teachers, who it makes them feel good. They really feel like they're doing something good. They're putting this child on a path potentially for life. And that teacher has that student for 1 year and then walks away. But the parents are stuck with that, not stuck, but obviously have a relationship with that child for life. And these medicalization can be very, very expensive process. And it's potentially lifelong. So the teacher doesn't see the downstream effects of their actions, and they have no responsibility to that child long term. And this is what we really need to address.
I think that's such a good point. It's such a good point. I mean, they're not in a position to know the child nearly as well as the family, and yet they're making this massive decision in collusion with a minor.
Exactly. And they're never going to have to see the impact of this thing that they've done, right? Like, first of all, they've gone there often. The teacher is telling kids that they all have a gender identity, and then they tell them what are the options are, right? And then the kids will think, oh, well, I'm a little more boyish, so I'm probably trans or whatever. I probably would have thought I was trans. Probably a lot of girls would have thought they were trans if they were growing up today, because a lot of girls are more tomboy, or they want to play sports or whatever, right? So then they pick this identity, and obviously they get social status for it. They get teacher attention, teacher validation. And if that's something that the child's not getting at home, it's very, very enticing and rewarding. So they're going to do it. And I think people underplay that a lot. And then, I forget where I was going with that, but they cement this identity. Then the teacher affirms it and whatever, and then they go off to the next school or to the next grade, and the teacher never has to deal with it again. Chances are that child is going to become an adult later who will look back and say, "What the heck did these people do to me? I was just a girl. I didn't have to be told that I might be a boy, or that I might be not a boy or a girl, or all these things. I should have been allowed to be a child. I should have been allowed to learn to read and learn to do math, and not be worried about all this oppression in the world that does exist, but has largely been imagined to be way worse than it is, and has become the number one thing that kids learn about every day in school." So
yeah, it's emotional manipulation in the extreme. And I had this parent on a little while back, a couple months back, to talk about the curriculum. He'd had to buy this curriculum from the textbook manufacturer because the school wouldn't give him access to it. And he did this under a pseudonym. And we went through some of the curriculum together that was being presented in an elementary school. And it's very clear how they are being incentivized to put themselves into these thought experiments about gender. And then they're being encouraged explicitly. There's direction for the teacher in how to give verbal rewards and praise for giving these certain kinds of answers, or showing the right amount of concern for the hypotheticals in which somebody's being marginalized. And so there's this way of very clearly manipulating children into wanting this bright, shiny identity.
I'm curious how having had the first march went on the 20th, what sort of effect that seems to have had so far? Are there any signs of, I know Trudeau came out and spoke against it. I'm curious whether parties that be may have, taken note, or I feel like there's more resistance. What do you think's the outcome of that? Or is it just more like at least people are mobilizing and seeing like, hey, there's a whole bunch of us?
Like at this point, I'm feeling like it's just a culture war that has to be won, like at the people level, like politicians are not going to do anything until it is popular to say the thing, right? And that's becoming more clear every day. Like our Minister of Education in Ontario has just been virtue signaling all week about residential schools and stuff. And like, I'm not saying, I don't know the history completely. I know residential schools have been bad in a lot of ways. They've also been good in some ways. But there's been a lot of misinformation about the history of like Canada and Indigenous peoples and stuff like that, and how there was mass graves and children who were found buried and stuff like that, which never happened. So I just think there has to be a reckoning of like, what is the truth with all this Indigenous history before we start virtue signaling about like doing better, reconciling, wearing an orange shirt and doing all these things. Like, I don't know. To me, like, I see his tweets and they make me so angry, because all he does is posture and act like he's actually, like, he cares and like he's inclusive and all this stuff. And he's actually also managed to get the conservative support, because he's put out a couple little things that say, oh, we should focus on academics, we should focus on writing and reading and math and blah, blah, blah. So people think that he's actually doing something, but then he just continues to virtue signal and nobody actually cares whether he's actually implementing policies to do the focusing on academics thing, which he hasn't done yet. So I don't know. I have not seen politicians rise up, and I think it's going to take a few more months probably before people realize that, like, unless they say something, they are not going to get elected again.
Right.
In the
I
chat.
think,
Oh,
yeah, sorry. I
go
think
ahead,
what
Catherine.
like Chanel's like referring to is, for people that are listening and are not quite understand, like aren't up to speed on what's happening in Ontario politics. We have a conservative party. They're called the Progressive Conservative. They are in power in Ontario at the moment, but they don't act like a conservative party. In fact, they've adopted many woke ideas, and I would say Doug Ford, who's the premier, the leader of the party, doesn't seem to be up to speed on these issues. And very often they're allowing woke policies to breed or fester in terms of education. And there's other areas as well that they're not demonstrating true conservative values. So what we need to do is, as parents, we need to rise up. We need to contact our local politicians, or at least our conservative ones, and we need to apply pressure. We need to apply pressure and say, like what Chanel was saying, like, we're not going to vote you back in unless you start to speak to what the issues are that are meaningful to us. And so what we're seeing is politicians are starting to speak on these issues. They're saying things, they're talking about parental rights, and they're saying that parents should have rights. But until they can back it up legislatively or with firm directives, right now it doesn't mean anything. And so there's a couple of conservative politicians on the provincial level that are very concerned, that share our concerns, and are starting to speak up. But again, it's because they're being flooded with letters from the community and very concerned about these issues. So we need to force. Politicians are not leaders, they tend to be followers. And so we need to get them to follow our lead and basically get rid of these bad policies and make changes legislatively in our to back up our parental rights.
Have any of you followed what's happened in the US school boards in terms of kind of flipping them back? Like, I know it's fairly recent in the States too, but it definitely happened before, like the pushback happened before it's happened in Canada. Do you know, like, I don't know, how did that start? How did it go? Like, what can we expect in Canada pretty much? Have any of you followed that at all?
I have a little bit with watching what FAIR has been doing. Mostly I know they've been offering like trainings, so to teach people like, how do you run for board? So I think and that's just one group. So I don't even know how many different groups are out there that are trying to basically train parents or whomever to maybe Moms for Liberty. I'm just trying to think of the different approaches that people are doing to activate people to run for boards. But I don't know that they are at this point, now dominated by people who might want to fight some of these things, but at least there's activity. Like, my sense is there's activity. It's going to kind of be like one seat at a time. It's kind of cumbersome, but there are people that are energized to try to do that.
And then there are other people who feel like the system is just too broken at this point and are pulling their kids out in droves. And I kind of wonder, one of the things I've kind of wondered about is the impact, the negative impact made by people who are soft on the ideology, like aren't into it, but aren't so opposed to it that they're pulling out. So we were talking about, I think, Catherine, you were talking about how get to know your kid's teacher. Some of the teachers are really going to be bulldogs for this. They're going to be big activists, and some of them are not going to be. And I wonder about the ones who are those of us, or those people who stand alongside the ideology, not calling it out directly while not selling it in extremely either. Doesn't that also do some harm, because it's sort of putting a soft smile on it, signaling acceptance in a way? And I wonder if that doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't give people something to push back against. It's almost like an oblique sliding it down the road, and encouraging a sort of soft acceptance of this.
Are you referring to educators? Like, are you talking about teachers that are accepting this, like in the classroom, like not pushing it?
Yeah,
Like pushing back?
specifically educators, but I think this in lots of ways socially, as we're going into this, you can kind of see that there's several camps. You've got the people who are really opposed. I mean, we did this a little while back. James Lindsay did a breakdown of this and kind of did like a taxonomy of the whole movement, with the activists on one end, and then the counter activists on the other end, and then the whole the middle ground being populated by a couple of different groups. Yeah.
15% versus like 15%, and everybody else is like,
Yeah.
Gonna watch a movie now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the problem is with the people that, I mean, how do you activate these people that are like sort of like the skeptics that know what's going on, but are not compelled to actually, speak up against it? There's two ways to look at it. Like, on the one hand, we do need some moderating voices inside the school system. Like, it's clear, like with what's happened to Chanel, and I'm thinking Jim McMurtry out in British Columbia, who was basically fired for telling the truth about what was actually happening about residential schools, and just saying, like, speaking the truth as a teacher can really have severe consequences, and you could be fired. And is that good, or is that good to have that teacher in that classroom being able to sort of tamp down more of this radical content that they're seeing from other teachers in the school? There's that angle. It'd be nice if everybody could just stand up, because my understanding is that in the schools that I'm talking to, people are telling me that they feel like 85% of the staff is not okay with this stuff, is not on board with it. They could all just stand up at the same time and show that there's a clear majority. That would be, ideal, but it's just not going to happen. Unfortunately, many teachers are sort of those caring, it's almost like the teaching profession is sort of self-selecting for a certain kind of person, and they do tend to be more herd mentality, more certainly caring, and that caring, that very caring nature is why many of these activists are, doing their activism, is because they actually do care. And they, I'm sorry for getting off the initial topic of the question. I feel like I'm
no, I think you're right on it. You're right on it
too, right? It selects, like your field too, selects for this kind of personality, I guess. And we have to remember too that this stuff didn't just happen overnight. Like it was small, and at the beginning it might have been just about real inclusion and treating people as just human beings, and including people no matter their sexual orientation, which a lot of people, and myself included, would agree with. But now, like, it was incremental, a little more, a little more, a little more, and now it's at the point where they're telling you that you have to accept that everything is white supremacy, and people are like, like, I didn't see this coming. And now it's like too late to say anything. And I have teachers who message me. They're like, I don't even know like where to start. Like, I personally, I don't know how they're surviving in the system. I think I would like just not be able to do it. But I have teacher friends who are still in there, and they sit through it. And there's some of them have started to audio record, like to record stuff, so that if anything happens, they have proof. Some of them are starting to speak up a little bit, and the ones who do are saying that they are now getting support from some of their colleagues, which is really nice. I think those people who are going to put themselves out there. You can't expect immediate support, but if you do it and you stand your ground and you do it in a way that's classy and kind of just makes sense, people will come to you. And it might take like a month or two, but people will be like, you know what, like I actually kind of agree with you. And that's what these teachers are seeing. So, and a lot of them have said to me too, like, I'm at the point where like, if I get fired, that's fine. I'm at my limit and I'm not agreeing to these things anymore. Like I sit there, I don't say anything, but I'm at my limit.
Is there room in the classroom for teachers who disagree vocally with this stuff?
Yes, but I think increasingly, no. Like so I think for a long time, you could kind of do your own thing in your own classroom. You could leave it pretty apolitical if you wanted to, but I think more and more what we're seeing is that teachers are being recruited to participate in things to where they have to say no if like they have to actively reject the ideology if they're not going to participate. Whereas in the past, it would have been more voluntary, like, hey, who wants to come to this LGBT day? And then you'd have like 3 teachers and you'd be like, yay. And now it's like, okay, we're doing the LGBT day. So if you don't want to do it, raise your hand. Like, who's going to raise their hand? You know, you're going to just get bulldozed. So that's what it's coming to.
I was just thinking about just wondering as you were talking there about like those individuals that are keen to promote inclusion, those who are keen to promote inclusion for the LGBTQ community. One of the things that came out of the Tavistock clinic in the UK that was closed down, one of the sort of unsaid secrets of it was the fact that they were almost they were transitioning, if you like, individuals who were going through puberty, and if they would have gone through puberty, they would have probably desisted in their need to transition. And actually the gender dysphoria was maybe evidence of the fact that they were going to become lesbian or gay later on in life. And that feels like that could be an angle to promote. Maybe certainly individuals who are lesbian and gay and bi in Canada, we should know about what's happening in these schools, because it could be that what we're doing is just simply converting homosexuals away from being homosexual.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you use that, like I've used that argument with them before, but it's really weird how when you're in this ideology, you just don't really consider anything else and you don't want to challenge your own beliefs. And it's so comfortable and so nice to just feel like whatever I think is good and whatever someone who disagrees with me is bad. And like, it's just a comfortable belief system. And like, I think they really, really believe that like children are born with this innate sense of whether they're a boy or girl. And it doesn't even cross their mind that these things are socially constructed in the sense that we're using stereotypes to define the boxes. And then we're saying, oh, I feel like I'm a boy because of these stereotypes.
And then they're selling you on medical technology in order to improve your sense of self, which is, it's, and you mentioned, Chanel, earlier about how a lot of teachers are buying into this because of their inborn sense of compassion, that these are people who are sort of geared towards wanting to take care of and nurture. And then you drew a parallel with psychology and counseling and stuff. And I think that's so correct. And also, in order to really get swept up in this, you have to be a rather emotionally driven, low information person, I would think, or at least in that mindset, because as soon as you start to think critically about it, the whole thing falls apart. Because you're like, if you're in the very, very short term, it's like the teachers, Catherine, you're talking about how you're with them for 1 year, you don't see the long term. Does it make you feel good in that 1 year to make that difference in that child's life and make them feel seen and make them feel cared for? Well, yeah, that might be really gratifying. I could imagine that. But if you start to think, just go down the line, just look down the timeline 5-10 years. What have you really done to this person? What have you done for them? And I guess that's the thing. It's, David, you made a really good argument there. It's really logical. And yet we're dealing with a movement that doesn't have room for logic because it's all emotionally driven.
I have one, we're almost at time, but I am curious. Does it look like, all these people rising up, does it look like there's this possibility of coalition building? Does it look like there's like a political party could form, or do people have such diverse other interests that this can maybe arise for this topic, but maybe would not sustain itself for something longer term in the political sphere?
Yeah, there are coalitions being built on this topic. And in fact, you're going to see more, like, we're just getting started in this country in terms of pushing back on this collectively. And so you're going to see another protest happen in October 21st. I understand. I'm seeing certain groups already publicizing that. And I think that we're going to have another Million March for Children October 21st, or something similar, some sort of similar, like
in Ontario
protest.
or across Canada.
Yeah, well, I'm getting rumblings that maybe they're trying to make it a worldwide sort of, like, have a
wow.
spillover. Like, I don't know. This has just happened, really quickly, and these things are sort of springing up and taking up a life of their own, and new people, and bringing new people on board. And so, yeah, the coalition, I find myself is like, I'm out there at the protest. I'm there as an individual. I have my set of beliefs, and I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not anti-gay rights. I'm actually pro-gay rights. I've been actually speaking up and supporting of gay rights since, like, I was a teenager in the 80s. I was, the fact that people are calling me homophobic now is, distressing, because it's not true. But then they're even, calling actual gay people homophobic as well. Just want to touch really quickly on what David said regarding this idea of how gay children are now being sort of converted. I think that's what you're getting at, to sort of trans kids, right? Well, we have Bill C-4 in our country, which is a law that prevents conversion therapy. But this also extends to people under the notion of gender identity and expression, which means that parents in Canada are prevented from taking a gender dysphoric or gender questioning child to a therapist to be able to question whether or not, like, work through why they're struggling with gender dysphoria, because that's considered conversion therapy. It also, however, prevents, and Jody earlier on in this live stream was talking about how there were actually gay children going through conversion therapy. She was talking about in the 90s, and it was a real thing, and it should never have happened. But this bill also prevents some children or some people, or even adults who are gay, from exploring therapy regarding their homosexuality. And in a way, it's sort of like this legislation is sort of anti-gay, because it's also, it's really pushing gay kids, as David was saying, to question their gender, and perhaps decide to transition and sort of trans the gay away, or whatever. I'm not sure if that's the right way of saying, but I appreciate what he was talking about.
I wonder if there's room for legal challenges based on the conversion therapy being attached to gender identity. I wonder if there's room for legal challenges against the schools who are pushing children to convert to trans identity or to alternative gender identities. Because if you look at some of the material, the way that it coaches teachers to teach the children, that looks like conversion to me. I mean, if we're going to just lay it out, they've pretty much laid out their playbook on how we're going to encourage kids to adopt these identities. And I just wonder if anybody's thought about that. But
there should be a legal challenge, I think, but
yeah.
It's, I guess, expensive and complicated. But
yeah, well, I wonder that's it's quite blatant when you look at it. The way that they coach the teachers to encourage certain answers in the children and certain perspectives in the children. And we see the results of it with the 13 to 20% of these kids in some of these instances now converting. I don't know. I just a thought.
So I know we probably have to wrap up, but I just wanted to say that our Law Society in Ontario has also been recently felled to, like, basically the woke. So even our legal system is under siege. So even if people were trying to bring cases, it's very challenging. It might be very challenging for them to win them. So.
Yeah, that's really alarming. And yeah, this is just, there's so much going on. I'm so grateful for the strength of people like yourselves, and what we're seeing in Canada, I think, is incredibly, it's alarming, but also encouraging to see the surge of people standing up against this. And I really hope that that's contagious. And I hope more people will get off the fence and start standing up for this. I loved what you said when we were talking before, Chanel, about how what you had this really great, like almost like pep talk speech. It's like, you're not going to go get killed. You're saying words. Just say the just don't put up with this. We're not asking you to march into battle. We're asking you to stand up and say, no, don't do this to my kid.
Yeah, no, exactly. A century ago, you would have been, recruited for war or something. Now you're just, you might lose your job, but like you can find another job. You can do something. Like people really do need to stand up. Like it's just getting worse, right? So, and it feels good to tell the truth. So it might be hard for a while, but you get stronger. The more you tell the truth, you just, you build yourself up, right? And then you are capable of taking on attacks. And I've lived that myself. I'm sure everyone here has. The second you step up into the public sphere, it's crazy. It's insane. And you have to, like, at one point, you just have to block it out and remember who you are, challenge your own beliefs, but not let them tear you down completely. And it becomes easier and easier with time. Now, I really don't pay any attention to the people who are just tearing me down. I think that I wish them the best. I think they're very broken. A lot of people will, just go out of their way to be mean to me or mean to Catherine or whoever. I think that's a sad lifestyle. I wouldn't do that to someone, but hopefully they will learn as things go along that we are not hateful, and we just want everyone's individual rights to be respected, right?
And it's part of being swept up in that emotional mob. And you're right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Would you remind people just one more time where to find you before we wrap up?
You can find me on Twitter, Chanel Pfahl, or at Shan Alpha, which is on the screen.
And you can find me on Twitter at Catherine Kronas. And you can also check out my network, www.lighthouseforum.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks, Deborah and David. We'll not see y'all next week, but we'll be back the Monday after.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.